Hello everybody, welcome into another lesson. So today we are starting the big unit on congruent triangles. Today we are literally just going to talk about congruent triangles. We're not going to do any methods for proving them congruent just yet. That'll be in the next lesson. What else? We're not gonna do anything too crazy. So today we're just going to talk about congruent triangles in general. So two triangles are congruent if and only if the corresponding parts of each triangle are congruent to each other. So here it's already stated that triangle BIG is congruent to triangle CAT. So triangle big is congruent to triangle cat. You have a big cat. A little bit of humor there, but as we see the congruency markers, angle B is congruent to angle C, angle I is congruent to angle A, and then angle G is congruent to angle T. And then sides BI and CA are congruent, sides IG and AT are congruent, and sides BG and CT are congruent. So if we're being asked to find what angle is angle G congruent to, angle G is congruent to, look at your congruency markers, angle T. So angle T is congruent to angle T by your congruency markers. And then what angle equals the measure of angle A? Well, look at your congruency markers. You have the measure of angle A here. Looks like the measure of angle I would be equal to the measure of angle A. So just go off your congruency markers to start with. Alright. Then BI, since you don't have the segment denoted, it's talking about a distance, but it's kind of the same concept. BI would be equal to, look at your congruency markers, it'd be equal to CA. So BI is equal to CA. Okay. Now, what side of the other triangle is congruent to side AT? Well, I think it's obvious. Side IG would be congruent to side AT. How about, now let's do this a little bit differently. What if we had triangle, we arrange this in a different order. We had triangle IGB. So it started out with triangle BIG. Now they've rearranged it to IGB. Well, you want to go based on your congruency markers in the next triangle to determine which order to go in. Good news is, in the next triangle, everything's arranged in the same order. Sometimes when you're trying to look for congruent triangles, your sides and congruency markers won't be in the same order. Sometimes, and we'll get to these ones, where you won't have any congruency markers at all. So IGB would be congruent to ATC in this case. It'd be congruent to triangle ATC. Based on that. Just go in the order of your congruency markers if you have them. That's what's going to help you. Okay. Now this time we start with the second triangle. They do CTA. Triangle CTA is congruent to what triangle? Well, start with your congruency markers. They're in the same order on the other triangle. That'd be triangle BGI. Just go in the order of your congruency markers. That'd be triangle BGI. And this is not a theorem at all. This is actually a very useful thing you're going to be able to use throughout your proofs. is that corresponding angles of congruent triangles are congruent. Corresponding angles of congruent triangles are congruent. You can use, which we can abbreviate when we do a proof as CPCTC. CPCTC, corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. So I think that's a very nice thing. Corresponding parts, well, corresponding angles, I should say corresponding parts. But yeah, angles are parts of a triangle, just like the sides are. Corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent, so CPCTC, whether that's an angle, a side, or what have you. So, yes, you're welcome for that. That's going to make your life so much easier when we go to prove triangles here in future lessons. Alright, what do we got here? Let's see, let's draw let's make this a little bit bigger so you can see it. This one's going to be interesting. Alright, so we have two triangles here. They tell us that these two triangles are congruent. So we already know these two triangles are congruent. When you're not given congruency markers, whenever you're not given them, you want to just look at the length of the sides of the triangle. Just look and see about how long each looks compared to the other. So I think it's plain to see that TO and RO would be congruent to each other. That's pretty plain to see. I think it's also plain to see that SO and KO would be congruent to each other, which would have to mean that ST and KR are congruent to each other. So if you don't have congruency markers to start with, it's very important to look at your sides and start marking your congruent sides. See which corresponds to which. And then by default, we know these two angles here are going to be congruent because, well, vertical angles are congruent, right? We know these two angles will be. Then it looks like the corresponding angles here would be S and K. Looks like angles S and K would be congruent based on what we see in the diagram, which means that T and R would have to be congruent to each other. Okay, so now we've established our congruency markers. That's something you really do want to do. So based on this, triangle STO is congruent to what? So if we go in order from this first triangle, triangle STO, look at your congruency markers. It starts with the 2 congruency markers, then 3, then 1 for your angles. You can pick your sides or your angles. I'm looking at the angles. So STO, so it goes 2, 3, 1 for the congruency markers on the angles, which means you want to do the same thing for the next triangle. Go 2, 3, 1, which would make it KRO. So triangle STO is congruent to triangle KRO. So yes, when you are not given congruency markers, you probably want to establish those for yourself first. Okay. Now, angle S would be congruent to angle what? Well, that'd be congruent to angle K. Why would it be congruent? Because of CPCTC. Congruent parts of congruent triangles are congruent. Alright, then we have line segment SO is congruent to line segment KO because, once again, that wonderful CPCTC. Congruent parts of congruent triangles are congruent. Alright. Then we can actually say that O is the midpoint of SK by the definition of midpoint. So by the definition of midpoint, O is the midpoint of line segment SK. And then they ask for angle T is congruent to, look at your congruency markers, it looks like angle R, once again by CPCTC. Which would then mean that now they're asserting that ST is parallel to KR. How can we say that ST is parallel to KR? Okay, well, let's look at this here. You have S lines ST and KR. Well, you have angle S and angle K which are congruent, right? Well, you have this transversal line segment SK. Wouldn't that make S and K alternate interior angles? So, since the alternate interior angles are congruent, we can say that line segment ST is parallel to line segment KR by alternate interior angles are congruent. So sometimes you'll have problems where it starts out with asserting that a triangle is congruent, and then you have to figure out what angles are congruent to which, and then you might even get into midpoints and even parallel lines. They might even, it's basically, this was a small proof, not a formal proof, but we ultimately were able to prove ST and K are parallel by alternate interior angles being congruent. So I thought that was a pretty neat problem. Okay. I think we'll just do one more and that should be it. It's going to be a relatively short lesson. Okay. There is a diagonal here, which will form two triangles. Got our vertices. Then we have our angles 4, 3, 1, and 2. It's also asserted that these two triangles are congruent to each other. Well, I think this one goes without saying that line segment LA is congruent to line segment LA. It's the side of both triangles. So I think that one's pretty obvious. As a matter of fact, since it forms the side of both triangles, I don't think we even need a congruency marker for the fact that it's the side of both triangles. Now, if you look at these two triangles, I think it's fairly obvious that PL would be congruent to AR, right? So we can put markers there, which would leave PA and LR being congruent to each other. So now we figured out which sides are congruent. So always establish your congruency markers. Okay. Now if we go in an order here, let's say we went PLA. We need to figure out which angles are congruent to which. Let's figure out which angles are congruent to which. PLA. Well, it would look like angle P would be congruent to angle R, because we'd have PLA and then we would have RAL. PLA, RAL. So it looks like we got that. Yep. PLA, RAL. Yep, by the congruency markers, that's how I determined it between each of these two triangles. So that's how I determined which angles were congruent, and I think looking at it, it's fairly obvious. Okay, what else do we have here? We have, if we're going PLA, so that would mean this angle here would be congruent to, if it's then RAL, that would mean it'd be congruent to this angle up here, which could only leave that angle 1 would be congruent to angle 3. That's all that would leave. Okay, so now we've established our congruency markers. In this one, they say this time is triangle PAL is congruent to what triangle? So go in the order of your congruency markers. Let's go with the sides. It might be easier. You have 2 congruency markers, none, and then 1. So PAL is congruent to, let's see, starts with 2 congruency markers. So that'd be RLA, triangle RLA. You want to go in the same order with both of them. Just, again, use your congruency markers as a guide. So now we've established these 2 triangles are congruent. And then we can say that line segment PA is congruent to which line segment? Well, that would have to be RL. If we're going in the same order in both triangles. Why are they congruent? Well, because of CPCTC. See how nice this is to use? CPCTC makes your life a lot easier. Now what else? Angle 1 is congruent to, we look at the congruency markers, it's congruent to angle 3. Why are they congruent? Well, because of CPCTC. You'll be amazed how much you'll use these in your triangle proofs. Then we could say, next we can argue that PA, line segment PA, is parallel to line segment RL. Why is that? Okay, so again, look at your angles. Angle 1 and 3, those are alternate interior angles, right? Because you have this transversal LA here. And both RL and PA are cut by transversal LA. And you have alternate interior angles that are congruent. So that's your reason. Alternate interior angles are congruent. And then what do they want? And then we can also say that angle 2 is congruent to angle 4 because of the wonderful CPCTC. Which then we can argue that PL is parallel to RA. Why are they parallel? Well, let's look at this. You have lines PL and RA, line segments PL and RA. They are both cut by transversal LA. And what do you know? 4 and 2 are both alternate interior angles. So by alternate interior angles being congruent, you can say that line segment PL is parallel to line segment RA. So basically, if you don't have congruency markers in two triangles, if they tell you that they're congruent and you don't have congruency markers, really look at your triangles to see which sides correspond to which. If you look at a diagram, it's usually going to be pretty obvious which sides and angles correspond to which. Once you've set up your congruency markers, if they ask you which triangle is congruent to the first one, go in the same order of your congruency markers as the letters are going. That's how you'll get the right answer for your triangle. And then, if you know your triangles are congruent, your segments and your angles will always be congruent because of CPCTC. Corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. And then sometimes they'll want you to prove that two lines were parallel. And usually that's going to be because of alternate interior angles being congruent, but you could also have same side interior angles supplementary or corresponding angles are congruent. So that's where these are all coming into play. So that's it for this lesson, just the rudimentary what are congruent triangles. Next lesson we'll get into ways of proving triangles congruent. We will have 3 new postulates. So I hope everyone has a good night. Take care.